Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session entitled The Rise of the Employee. Now, the rise of the employee is a trend that we're currently seeing where the voice of the employee can no longer be ignored. Diversity and inclusion are critical to building a healthy workplace culture, and now more than ever, we're seeing employees select their employers based on the culture and the values within an organisation. 2020 has not just been a year of pandemic, it's also been a year that's seen many social and environmental issues come to the fore with increasing intensity, and employees are looking to their employers to understand sort of where do we stand on these issues and how can we get behind and affect some change as well. So today we are very pleased to welcome Leila Gurruwiwi, who is a media commentator, actor, cultural ambassador and mentor. And her passion for creating safe work and social environments for minority groups is nothing less than inspiring. Leila's story is an important one for all Australians to hear, and I'm going to hand it over to her now to share her story, and we're going to come back soon for some Q&A. Over to you, Leila.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. My name is Leila Gurruwiwi, but the majority of people know me as Leila Gurruwiwi, and as a proud Yolngu woman from Northeast Arnhem Land, the Gulpul clan. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I live and thrive, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay respects to all our elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that may be on this Zoom today. I would also like to acknowledge all the other lands that and land traditional owners of all the other places that you may be joining us from here today as well. I think in relation to the rise of the employee, I thought the best way to kind of talk to this is to talk about my story in my life, just generally. So I'm originally from Northeast Arnhem Land, a little remote community in a really small part of the world in the Northern Territory, and I'm one of 8 children. It's considered a place where there isn't a lot of opportunities for people. So my mum and dad made the decision when I was very young to send me away with extended family members to get more opportunities and more, paths in life, so to speak. So at the age of 18 months old, I ended up moving down to Victoria to a little country town. Well, it was a little country town when I was growing up, Bendigo. And that's where I grew up the majority of my life until I was about 17 years old. Per capita, Bendigo is the most Anglo-Saxon community in Australia. So I kind of like to say that I was a little black dot in a sea of white growing up there. It was interesting. I didn't actually know English when I first moved down. So I learned English when I first, it was just something that happened when I first started going to school. My guardian, who I was living with at the time, told the students, my classmates, that I couldn't speak English. So that she said that they needed to help me learn how to speak English. And that's generally how I learned. I pointed at things and they would tell me what it is and repeat and repeat. But because English wasn't my first language, I had a bit of a stutter whenever I read anything or out loud or did any kind of work around that sort of stuff. So I was put into an intensive reading course around grade 3 or grade 4. And 2 things happened in that space. One, it made my English very good, and then it opened up my love of reading. And I can't even count the amount of books I've read in my lifetime in the 32 years of my existence. But I thank my school for doing that, putting me in that intensive course. And Bev was a lovely old lady that would come to my school to do that course with me. So thank you, Bev, and my school for allowing me to do that. Because all these years later, who would have thought that would have, just that one little thing that happened when I was in grade 3 or 4 put me in great stead to be able to do all the things that I do now, like public speaking, working on Margaret, working on, often auto cue, being able to do all these different things. And I probably wouldn't have been able to do any of those things if that action wasn't taken way back when I was still in primary school. Let's just jump into high school. I grew up in, like I said, a very Anglo-Saxon space. The majority of my friends when I grew up didn't look like me. Yes, there was an Aboriginal community in Bendigo, which I was involved in. I have a adopted Koori family that I consider family as well. But the majority of my friends are Anglo-Saxon, and they're people who I'd perceive as kind of my ride or dies, people that I can depend on for anything and everything, and understand their own privileges in life as well, which is really important. And they're also people that I can have really kind of in-depth conversations and hairy conversations with as well. So I'm very happy that I have that in my life. I ended up moving up to Melbourne in my last year of VCE because of family stuff, and I ended up working for 6 months at the Aboriginal Family Violence Prevention and Legal Service, which is now called JIRA. And I was there for 6 months because through my VCE they couldn't change all my subjects, transfer all my subjects over to the school that I wanted to go to. So I had a choice of either redoing the whole of Year 12 or doing the last bit of Year 12 with a whole bunch of subjects that I didn't know. So I went and worked for 6 months and then came back and redid the whole of Year 12 because it was really important for me to graduate, because I saw that that was one of the reasons why my parents wanted me to come down to Victoria, was to get a good education and to graduate. One of the highlights in my life is still my mum coming down and seeing me graduate in 2006. It was a while ago now, but yeah, back in 2006. And then in 2007, it might be hard to believe, but I was still a very shy young Aboriginal woman at the age of 19. And I wasn't very good at talking to people and being in new places, new spaces, all those sort of things. So I ended up working at 3KND, which is an Indigenous radio station here in Melbourne, 1503 AM on your AM dial for anyone who's interested. And basically while I was there, I did radio training, and I got to interview people I knew, people that I didn't know, and it was a good kind of starting point for me, considering everything else was a little bit too overwhelming. But that year in 2007 was also the year that NITV started, National Indigenous Television Service. And the Margaret Footy Show radio show was the first ever commissioned show on that TV channel. Grant Hansen created that radio show purely because he recognised that there was no platform within the mainstream space on television and on radio for Indigenous voices. So he created the Margaret Footy Show radio show to give that voice to Indigenous players that were playing at the time, to be able to talk about the sport they loved. So NITV came along and said to Grant, we want to create a television show out of your radio show. In his mind, he was like, great, this is awesome. That's exactly where I perceived this going. So he came to me and told me this very excitedly. And I said to him, that's great. I'm so happy for you. Why are you telling me this? What's this got to do with me? And he basically said to me, look, I know you love your footy. I know you're just doing radio training at 3KND, but I really want you to be on Margaret. I really want you to be a female voice, another Indigenous voice. I really want you to be on the show. And I just said to him, no, I can't do that. I'm 19 years old. I'm 6 months out of high school. I can't do anything. Like I can do an interview on radio, but how am I supposed to do it on television and interview all these AFL players? And he just said, oh, it was fine. And he basically pushed me down the deep end to see if I could sink or swim. And luckily, all these years later, I swam very well. And that's what I've been doing for the majority of my adult life, is working on the Margaret Footy Show, which is an Indigenous AFL football show. We get to interview Indigenous and non-Indigenous AFL footballers. We celebrate rounds, like significant rounds like Indigenous round. We have really big shows around that. We used to do Titters Tips, which was a girls tipping segment on the show. We've had a number of female hosts that have been on the show regularly, myself, Emily Feehan, Kylie Farmer, Sandy Greenwood and Shelley Ware. And we were probably one of the first AFL football shows that had ongoing female talent in that space, which was really, really a good thing from our point of view anyway. And even though we perceived ourselves as an Indigenous football show, our show was definitely a vehicle for reconciliation. We had Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on the show, artists, musicians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, because we had a real kind of love and, we wanted to kind of put a focus on Australian music, because there hasn't been a space where, live Australian music was seen on television in that space and in that kind of prime time space. So we had those sort of things on the show. It's really hard to even think of, a moment, a favourite time that I've had working on the show, because there's been so many and they've all blurred into like, about 12 years worth. So, but I think two of my really good kind of moments while working on Marngrook would have been the women's shows that we had. The earlier one, maybe back in 2010-ish, that one was really good. And then one that we had more recently, where Shelley and I think it was 2018. Yeah, it was 2018, and we hosted the whole entire show. And that was really good, and I thoroughly enjoyed being able to even have the opportunity to be able to do that. Was really, really good. Marngrook also allowed many other doors to open for me. I've been on different panels talking about, sports and all sorts of different things. I've also done a little bit of acting. I did Team of Life, which is actually a theatre play based around AFL and soccer. It talks to two different minority groups, so Aboriginal people and their love of AFL football, and then the South Sudanese community and their love of soccer. And that was the first time that I'd ever met and spent time with people from the South Sudanese community, and just doing that whole entire theatre play, rehearsing for it for a number of months, and then touring it, to different places in Australia, as well as a regional tour of schools, high schools here in Victoria. It was amazing to see the similarities that we had with, this African community from the other side of the world. And those people are still really good, close friends of mine. And it was just another wonderful opportunity to share stories and share culture in that space. And Heath Fergusson, who was my on-screen husband, so to speak, or on-stage husband on Team of Life, was also my on-screen husband in Secret River, which is another show that I was in. And the wonderful thing about being on Secret River was that space was it felt really safe, because there was lots and lots of Indigenous people from all over Australia that were on set. And there was just that camaraderie and, just that feeling of safe, because even though we were all blackfellas from all different communities, we were one family while we were on set and in that space together. And Dana Reid, who was the director of Secret River, she actually approached me on a number of occasions to look at different scenes for Secret River, and asking me whether they were culturally appropriate. So even though I was an actor in that space, she also acknowledged not my expertise, but the fact that I could bring my knowledge, of my Indigenous knowledge, into the space to make sure that particular scenes were culturally correct, and that there wouldn't be any offence taken by them. A good example was, there was a scene where I was supposed to be out hunting, and there were men that were there, and I think they were either getting a kangaroo, or I think it was a kangaroo, and they were going to be coming back from the hunt with that. And I let Dana know that that's actually not how we do things. With Indigenous people, the women go out with the women and hunt, and we hunt particular things, and then the men go out and they hunt together and they hunt particular things, especially game like a kangaroo and whatever. So at no point in time would we cross that over, and would I be in a space where there's other Indigenous men that are hunting, especially for game. And she understood that and was like, okay, no worries, well, we'll just nix that completely and we'll take you out of the scene and just have the men in that space. And I was like, yep, that's right. And that was in the show, and it's just an example of, you know, someone seeing the potential that you have, that you can create, you know, a space again, even on a TV show that's culturally appropriate, and one that is going to be accurate as well. So Margaret, while I was doing Margaret, I also ended up working for the Deadly Sister Girls Foundation, which is a part of the Wirrapunda Foundation. And basically that was a space, it was mentoring young Indigenous girls from the age of 13 to 17 in high schools, talking to them about walking in two worlds, in the Indigenous world, but also in the Western space, you know, non-Indigenous space, and what that looked like. We talked to them about all sorts of things about Aboriginal history, culture, as well as mental health, sexual health, all of those sort of things. And it was in that moment that I realised how important it is that we share that knowledge with the next generation that's coming, and creating young, strong leaders that, you know, want to go into this space and create change and make sure that these spaces are safe, not just for us, but for the next people that are coming along. And I really thoroughly enjoyed working for working in the Deadly Sister Girl space. And the wonderful thing about it is they say that things kind of go around in a circle. And with Deadly Sister Girls, one of the schools that we'd go to all the time to do our program was actually Eagle Hawk High, which is a school based in Bendigo. So I'd have to travel down to Bendigo to do that program down there, and it was just wonderful being back in my hometown where my roots are, so to speak, and just share that knowledge with those young girls there. And one of the schools that we actually did the program with was the Pavilion. The Pavilion School is a school based here in Melbourne, in Preston, and it's a school for kids that don't fit into the normal mainstream schooling system. And unfortunately, there was a high proportion of Indigenous students that were in that space. And they were a really great school. They still are a great school. And I got introduced to them by doing the program. And funnily enough, again, it's funny how things work, but I ended up finding out on the grapevine that funding was going to be finishing for my work at Deadly Sister Girls, and that the role that I had at that moment in time probably wasn't going to be there the next year. So I remember sitting in at the Pavilion School. They had a RAP meeting, and sitting there, and I was going through their RAP and looking at different things, and I noticed that one of their things that they wanted to tick off on their RAP was having an Indigenous support worker, and that they didn't have one at the time. So I thought to myself, well, you know what, I'm going to take the initiative on this RAP. I believed in the principles of the school. I loved what they were doing with all the students, especially the Indigenous students in that space. So after the RAP meeting, I sat down, I spoke to the principal, Josie, and sat down with her in her office and said, look, I know that I've been told that the funding's going to run out, and I know for a fact that you guys are looking for an Indigenous support worker. I love what you guys do here. I love the energy in this space. I would love to become a part of your team if you will have me. And in that moment, unofficially, she said that I'd gotten the job. but yeah, so we, there was eventually, a job interview and all those sort of things and whatnot. But I ended up working there for nearly 4 years. Was that I wanted to do in that space to make sure that it was more culturally appropriate space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, especially, that it was safe for them, as well as creating, you know, opportunities and events for the other students to embrace Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. You know, we did, you know, events for Reconciliation Week. We also did events for NAIDOC Week. We did Harmony Day every single year. So I would invite staff as well as special guests from outside the school to come and tell their stories about, you know, their backgrounds and where they're from. And then we'd have a big, huge kind of lunch where we'd share different foods with each other. And I thought that was, you know, another great way of, you know, being inclusive of everyone's journey in that space. So that was really good and really fun. And yeah, it was just a really good space to be in. And yeah, sometimes I miss it, yeah, being in that space. But, you know, your journey changes and you always end up, you know, going into another space and finding new challenges. And that happened to me. And last year I ended up taking a job at Catholic Education Melbourne, as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Officer alongside Helen Christensen. And there our job is to look after all of the Aboriginal students within the Archdiocese of Melbourne in all of the primary schools and high schools, support them and their parents, as well as supporting schools just around, again, cultural competency, around what they can do to create safe spaces for Indigenous students, and all those sort of things. So our biggest thing for us is really just making sure that we keep people accountable around those things, making sure that funding that's accessed for Indigenous students is used for Indigenous students. Every year we have a Wada Day, which is a cultural day that we have for all Indigenous students in the Melbourne region to come to KGI, Kurrangamaji Institute, which is based at the Richmond Football Club. And again, it's just a day of Indigenous cultural workshops, incursions, so that all the Indigenous students can meet each other and connect, because there's not a lot of times when they can actually do that, when they're all, you know, scattered in all these different schools. And where they can, you know, outwardly, you know, show pride in their culture and be in a safe cultural space and talk about things that they may not feel comfortable doing so at school, for example. And we are going to be running another one for that for primary schools, hopefully next year. And I'm actually going back to work next week, actually. So yeah, that'll be interesting. I have been on maternity leave for the last year, and I think being a mum, being a new mum, being a mum to a now nearly 1-year-old is a big drive now for me to do the things that I need to do to make sure that these spaces are culturally safe, culturally competent for my son. And even though he's only a year old now, I hope that the steps that I take and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people take will make life easier for him, so that he doesn't feel like he needs to constantly defend himself or constantly be, you know, on guard, or, you know, which is what's happened to me at times, and what's happened to a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that I know has happened to them, you know, not just in the workplace, but, you know, with their own friends, on social media, just out and about, you know, living our lives on the street. So hopefully all these changes will, you know, will help the next generation and help the generation that, you know, my son Uzo's in. But yeah, so that's, you know, that's me in a nutshell, and that's me, and that's my life. And yeah, they're just all sorts of examples of how, you know, the things that I bring to the table have been able to help other people. And yeah, so I don't know if anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask, but I know Vanessa's got a few questions as well.
Yeah, Absolutely. We do have some questions lined up for you, but thank you so much, firstly, for sharing your story with us. And importantly, thank you for all the great work that you do in this space. I think we need to multiply you by a million to keep getting these messages out there and make sure that we have a better world for the coming generations. And I know I'm going to actually jump in with my own question first. I hope you don't mind, but you mentioned your beautiful 11-month-old son. And you told me when we met the other day about how you decided on a name for him. Are you able to share that story?
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing that story with everyone?
Yeah, no worries. So when we found out, well, my partner is Nigerian, Igbo, and I'm Indigenous. And when we first found out that we were pregnant, we did what every other parents-to-be did and started considering names. And we thought about it for a little while, and we came to the realisation that we wanted our baby to have a culturally significant name. We wanted him to have an Igbo name, we wanted him to have a Yoruba name, and we did not want him to have a Western name or a white name, because this is something that has been put on people of colour for a really long time, that if you have a traditional name, you must have a Western name, due to people not being able to, pronunciation, all those sort of things, the fact that we live in a Western country. But we decided to go against the grain and thought, no, we want him to be proud of his culture. And by doing that, we gave him the name Uzoma, which in Igbo means good path. And then Wachura is a Yoruba name, and he was actually named after one of his grandparents that recently passed away. And that particular grandparent was a strong leader within our community. So the whole idea is whoever you're named after, you end up embodying the traits that person has. So his name is Uzoma Wachura Ani. And we did that specifically because we felt like in 2020 you should be able to use traditional names and not have to have Western names.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that with us all. So now switching back a little bit to the workplace, I have a couple of questions around how we can do better. So I lead an HR function for our company, and so I'm always trying to attract talent, and in doing so, I would love to be able to attract more minority groups, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we want to be able to do it in a way that doesn't come across as just ticking boxes in when it's job ads that we put together and that sort of thing. So how can we position ourselves as employers and as employers of choice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
I think first and foremost, it's about understanding the culture within your organisation and whether or not the culture is safe for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would suggest consultation, either with directly with an Aboriginal org. Here in Melbourne, we have the Wurundjeri Council. Myself, I could come in and have a look and see what there is that you do have and where the holes are in your space, and then taking on board what is said and changing them, because sometimes when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, especially when they're already employees in the space, suggest certain things, they end up coming to a brick wall, or being forced back by litigation, by corporate, just corporate in general. And then there's this perception that you've just become this person that's making it difficult for everyone, whereas really you're just wanting to see change, and again, not just for yourself because you're in that space now, but for every other Indigenous employee that's going to sit in that space after you. And you don't necessarily want them to feel the way that you do right now, so to speak. I think it's important for consultation, even if it's with Aboriginal elders. Being aware, like, do you know who the traditional owners are in your community? Do you know who the leaders are in your community, in your Aboriginal community? Do you know who the elders are within your Aboriginal community? Things like acknowledgements. Even to this day, I still go to places when people are doing acknowledgements and see people rolling their eyes like, oh, here we go, another acknowledgement. It's really important that we acknowledge where we are. There's been a lot of devastation and hurt that's happened in this country. And just by doing that and acknowledging those that walked before us and what happened to those people before us is cathartic for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's why for me it's important that we do that protocol, and why I do it before I talk in any sort of space. Yeah, that's just one example of, people, kind of thinking that it's a bit, PC, so to speak. I think in relation to like doing interviews, doing an acknowledgement in an interview will immediately tell an Indigenous person, oh, okay, so they know about this. Does your organisation have a RAP, a Reconciliation Action Plan? Are they actually doing things within that RAP? Do they celebrate NAIDOC Week? Do they celebrate Reconciliation Week? Are they aware of significant dates within the year where things happen in Indigenous spaces? All those sort of things. Do they know about Aboriginal history? Do they know about Charlie Perkins and the Freedom Rides? All those sort of things. It's just about, opening your mind to more knowledge and educating yourself in that space. And, like I always say, if even if you know someone that's Aboriginal, it's not necessarily to go and ask that one person, because we don't have all the answers. We live in a world where there's so much information. There's the internet, there's TV shows, there's dramas, there's documentaries, there's all sorts of movies now that are kind of coming out in that space that are very similar to, Secret River, that are talking about, colonisation and the history that's happened here in Australia, which lots of people still don't know about. Again, we can't heal if people don't know what we're healing from. So those are some of the things that an organisation could do. You could do a cultural awareness course, have someone come in, talk about those sort of things, have elders come in, tell their stories, so that you can hear firsthand what happened to mob in this country. It's all about creating empathy, because a few years ago I remember watching a video online, and it was this young Aboriginal woman that was standing on the beach, and she had a blindfold on, and she had her hands out saying that she wanted free hugs, that she was offering hugs to people. And at the beginning there wasn't anyone that came to her, and then eventually people started coming up and giving her hugs, giving her hugs, giving her hugs. And then right at the end it basically said that, I think it was like 30% of Australians said that they trusted Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I thought that was the worst statistic I'd ever seen in my whole entire life. But it just drives the point that it's because of misunderstanding, misrepresentation, that people perceive us in a certain way. And at the end of the day, we only make 2 to 3% of the population. So in order for us to be able to change, we need help from the 97% of the population, the rest of the population, to shift and move, create movement where there is an acceptance of Aboriginal culture, and, it's not perceived as PC or whatever, that it's an integral part of being Australian, I think. I know that's very long-winded, but I just went on.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. And particularly what you've mentioned around needing allies. We see that in, happening in other areas of the world where we need the majority to stand up and be an ally, and not just be non-racist, but to be anti-racist and actually get in and affect change. So thank you for that. And also for pointing out that there are community groups that we can contact and bring in to help us set up perhaps our recruitment practices and those sorts of things. That's really useful, and I'd love to sync with you later, and perhaps we can share some resources and contacts on the Expo site around that. So thank you.
Good.
You also mentioned documentaries and things as well, which brings me to the next question that's come through. So sporting organisations have come under the spotlight in terms of addressing racism, especially with events that surround the Adam Goodes documentary, The Final Quarter. How do you think we're doing as a country and as a business community in actually moving towards that reconciliation?
Okay, so
big question.
Yes. The Adam Goodes saga, yes. That took up a whole kind of space in our lives, especially because one, we're Indigenous, and then two, I worked in the AFL. I worked on my group, which is a part of the AFL space. I know Adam. He's been on the show a number of times. He's won our My Group Player of the Year a number of times. Great man. I feel like the AFL didn't do enough for him at the time. It was really, really sad to see him retire the way that he did. Anyone that saw the final quarter, we actually had the final quarter on. We did it as our NAIDOC screening last year. We had it as our NAIDOC screening, and we raised money for Opening the Doors Foundation, which is a foundation that helps Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids within the Catholic system. But we screened it at our organisation at CEM. But anyone that saw the final quarter could see how much all of that affected him. Physically, emotionally. You could see by the time that he'd finished that his soul was completely spent. His body, his physical appearance, everything. And it was just so sad for me to see him that way, considering, for so long he'd been this amazing giant that would run out in front of the Swans and take them out there, to the premierships that they had. And it slightly annoyed me that people were so caught up in those last few months of his career and calling him all these sort of names and all these sort of things, and not remembering all the good that he had done. The amazing role model he is, the amazing mentor he is to other Indigenous players, not just at the Sydney Swans, the amazing foundation that him and Mickey O have that help, young Aboriginal kids get into universities. He does so much for our community and also for the wider community, but people forgot all that because they were just so concentrated on what he said in his Australian of the Year speech, and then all this booing and why people were perceiving it a certain way and, saying that, no, it's not racism. But I have news for you. If someone's saying to you that something doesn't feel right and it's making me feel a certain way, you need to listen to that. They're telling you that it's making them feel a certain way. So it doesn't mean it's okay to keep doing it. And I think people forget that. And people definitely did in that moment. And so I feel like the AFL didn't do enough for him at that time. Even after everything that happened, he didn't even do the motorcade at the AFL Grand Final because he didn't feel safe to do that. And again, the AFL being on that footy ground, that's his workplace, that's his office, and he should be able to go out there, play a great game and feel safe, and he didn't. And so I felt really, really kind of sad for him, and then angry at the AFL, and then angry at fans for doing what they did, and I had to take a break from social media because every man and his dog had an opinion on it, and it was just so toxic being in that space as well. And I think it's just a reflection on how it is a reflection on how we are as a country, because that's our country's game. That's, the number one game in our country, AFL football. And the fact that, people were so kind of blasé about Adam's feelings on the football field. It's like, well, how am I as an Aboriginal woman walking down the street supposed to be perceived if, this man that they put on this huge pedestal up here was feeling that way, So we've definitely got lots and lots and lots of steps, forward not just in the sporting arena, but also in our country, to make Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel accepted and wanted and needed and valued. We are the longest living culture on the planet, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. One, lots of people don't know that. Two, if I was an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, but I'm extremely biased, if I was an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, that would be something that I would be hanging my hat on. Like, I live in the country with the oldest living culture in the world. But again, people don't perceive, generally I'm talking about, people don't perceive what we have to give or offer as valuable, which is really sad, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture has so much that we could teach and learn, not, learn from you and learn from us, that we could share, but, depends on who's willing to come to the table.
Certainly, education and awareness are critical to moving forward in this. And you mentioned, of course, NAIDOC Week and Reconciliation Week. Interestingly, my kids celebrate these weeks at daycare, at creche, but we rarely see it in the workplace. I think that getting it out there and having workplaces just embrace these things will take us a long way. But coming back to this theme around children, we've talked a little bit about your son. How do you feel about his future? Are you optimistic for his future, and that it will be a better experience for him than it has been for you?
It's weird. At times I feel optimistic, and then at times I feel pessimistic, and it kind of floats in between the two, depending on what's going on in society, what's going on in our world. We are now global citizens. We are connected through social media, and obviously we all know what happened to George Floyd not quite recently, and George Floyd was a Black man. My son will grow up to be a Black man. My fear is that he will be put in that position and something like that could possibly happen to him. That's a real fear that I have. I also fear the fact that I will be talking to my child about racism before talking to him about relationships and girlfriends, boyfriends and sex. I know that for a fact, because I know every other person of colour, especially Black people, especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that's a conversation we have to have very early on, because unfortunately in this day and age, racism rears its ugly head really, really early. So it's hard. I'm very optimistic that he's going to be an amazing, young man and a courageous leader that's going to do wonderful things in this world. But I'm also very aware that he's still going to come up against lots of different obstacles. But I just hope that, we put the things in place now that, he'll be able to smash those, those glass ceilings and go to the next level, by the time that he's my age, so to speak. But it's a balance. Sometimes, I feel really good about it, and other times I don't. And it's just ongoing. And I feel like that's just how it is being Aboriginal and being a Black mother and being a person of colour. Unfortunately, comes part and parcel with our existence, our lives, I guess.
So, you've mentioned that you'll need to speak to your son about those really tough topics of racism probably at a young age. And I just want to say that as a white ally, I need to do the same with mine. I need to talk to him about these topics early on. I need to educate him. I need to make him aware and respectful and also an ally. So I feel that we could talk all afternoon. I've really enjoyed hearing from you on these topics, and I have learned so much, and I hope everyone else who's joined us today has learned from this and will aim to do better. But with that, we are going to say thank you and wrap up for now. I believe we've got afternoon tea happening, and then we will be joining back on the main stage at 4 p.m. So thank you very, very much, Leila, for coming in and sharing your story and answering some pretty tough questions as well. It's been just a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.